Hello, everyone out there. This is John Kountouris, and you're listening to Greek News on Demand, GreekNewsOnDemand.com. The following is a recording of a broadcast of the Free American with Clay Douglas, in which I appeared as a guest speaker. We go over the details of the Greek economic crisis, and it is in two parts. You will now be listening to part one, and after that, stay tuned for part two. Thank you.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another edition of the Free American. A little over 20 years running now. John Kountouris is my guest today. Hello, John. How are you?
Good morning, Clay. Good morning to all your listeners. I'm doing great. Thank you very much. How are you?
Oh, I'm really, really good, but that could be a rumor I started. Are you from Greece originally?
No, born and raised in Denver, Colorado. Basically, I lived here all my life, but I've taken many trips back and forth from here to Greece. And it's just a process that I've gone through for about 15 years in my life, where I've had to rediscover my roots as a Greek American, to basically learn in depth the Greek language, the Greek culture, to go and live in Greece for a while to understand the Greek element there. So this has been a big process, a big journey for me. And I'll explain to your audience why.
All right. My congratulations. I think, and as a matter of fact, I'm going to be rewriting some novels that I started 45 years ago to change the focus from New Orleans to Denver, because I believe that Denver, Colorado, is our future. I'll explain why later on. And they've taken a step to stop the police state in America.
That's right. Yes, they have.
I think
there's a lot of
a little over 80 years ago, the elitists, whoever they are, stole our billion-dollar crop, stole our number one cash crop in America. They stole it from us. It was called hemp.
Yes, sir. That's right.
So you're living in Denver now?
No, I've been out here in Los Angeles for many years now, nearly 30 years. Came out here in 1985. I'm 38 years old now. So, but basically, the whole thing with Greece is not so much having Greek roots as it is understanding Western civilization itself, and also understanding the roots of this nation, of America. And most people out there have this incredible misconception that America basically was just founded on these guys from Europe, and there were some elitists and internationalists and enlightenments that were involved in this, and you know, they wanted a more democratic and free world and this and that and all that, and you know, that's pretty much it. There's a lot of Americans though out there too that believe that basically America owes so much, a big huge debt of gratitude to basically all the Jewish intellectuals that basically supposedly developed this nation, particularly within the past 100 years, with all the major developments that we have had, and think that it's the Jews that have contributed to everything, of course, to what America is today, and this and that, and blah, 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 and everything else. There's also a huge conservative voter base of Christians out there who think that not only is that true, but they also think, though, that their very belief system itself with regards to Christianity is wholly and solely based on Judaism. So for the past 15 years, basically, I've been studying, researching, and rediscovering, and basically reinterpreting with my own research and revising all of this. And basically, I've had to start from the ground up because a lot of what we understand today about America and, you know, its roots and its foundings has nothing to do with what they tell us in the schools or in the media, et cetera, et cetera. And that really is the issue here. And in my first book that I wrote in 2014, it's called Your Academic Guide to the Greek Language, Culture, and Civilization by John Kountouris. This book is very critical and very key because it contains a lot of stuff about the Greek culture, the Greek language, the history from ancient Greece all up to today. And what I do is I start off with the language because the language is everything. Communication is everything. The ancient Greek language was basically crafted in a way to bring about a intellectual revolution amongst the Greek people, and this occurred thousands and thousands of years ago. And the letters were designed in such a way where it would stimulate intellectual activity. And when the first major forum came about, it literally, according to Greek scholars, led to the great Renaissance and revival that happened amongst the Athenians, and after that, all of Greece. And then they started to create amazing and wonderful, you know, things for their society at that time, and it led to the Golden Age. And that's when Greece became great not only in Athens, but basically, you know, all over the world. So basically, I talk about how what the Greeks accomplished in the past, how it formed many, many different syllables. I mean, for example, every European language out there is a subset, literally, of the Greek language, whether it be Italian, et cetera, because a lot of them first came through Latin, which, of course, comes from Greek. And not only that, recent discoveries are now proving and showing that the original Italian, the Romans, which were the Etruscans, were nothing more than a sub-Greek tribe. So, you know, the Greeks accomplished a lot of stuff. So, starting off basically with the language, I demonstrate and I show just how important it was to forming civilization. Now, what I deal with the language part is how I'm able to teach it more effectively to seminary students in all the major seminary schools across America. Now, our Christian students are the future, basically, of America, and the reason why I say that is because the churches today, particularly the Protestant churches, they are a huge, huge voter base of support for politicians who support the whole thing about Israel, supporting Israel. And these Christians, of course, are influenced by the theology that they believe. That's why they vote for these politicians who support Israel. Now, my whole goal with this book is to basically get seminary students to take their thinking away from this whole the Jews are God's people thing to the fact that the Greeks, first of all, offered everything to our civilization. But number two, it was the Greeks, though, that took over Christianity after the apostolic era. And they, through the Byzantine Empire, ruled the world for over 1,100 years. And this is entrenched not only in the theology of the Greek Orthodox Church, but this is something that all the nations understood and believed. This is something, you know, that the greatest scholars have written about. This is something that Ezra Pound wrote about, that Eustace Mullins wrote about.
Eustace Mullins was a good friend of mine. I was trying to bring him out to my home there in New Mexico when he died. I was in the process of that. He's appeared on my show many times.
Yeah, I believe I've heard a couple broadcasts where you had him on. Yeah, that's he was an amazing. He plays a big role in my life and my work, which I can describe later. But he wrote the most amazing, revealing things about Greece, about basically the reason why not only Greece, but all of Western world is in the crisis situation it is today. And he was specific, too, with regards to Greece. In his book, The World Order, he wrote specifically the reason why the Byzantine Empire, fell, which is what I'm talking about now. My whole goal is to get Christians here to understand that truly, if you want to talk in an ethnic sense, the Greeks really are God's chosen people in a sense, because not only has every other nation out there been influenced by them, not only are the roots of this nation, basically are derived from Hellenism, but, the Greeks, they left a huge, amazing legacy. And this is something for the whole world, and this is something that is not taught today in your Christian seminaries. It's not taught, basically, in the schools today. I mean, go to any public school and teach your kids about the Byzantine Empire. Or go to any major college.
I call what we have here the public fool system. So
yes,
I'm not a big fan. I certainly didn't learn to read in the public school system. I could read 1,000 when I went into the first grade. So, not a big fan of our public school system. And let me tell you, I'll be doing later this week. I'll be doing more interviews with an archaeologist who talks about the worldwide civilization that the Greeks talked about. They told us about Atlantis. They told us about this worldwide civilization. I mean, I find it absolutely amazing that there's pyramids all over the world, and we can't build one today. How did they get there? There had to be some type of transportation to be able to achieve that, and they knew about it in Greece, didn't they?
Yes, they did, and what you're touching on is a very important subject, which of course ties into all of this. The Greeks developed so many amazing technologies, it's ridiculous, including, of course, the whole sewage and toilet system, which is one of the most important inventions they ever did. But I talk about that too in my second book, Hellenic Crisis by John Kountouris, which is the definitive work on the Greek crisis, which is going on now. I've labored over this for 5 years, and this is something that is going to really wake up everyone to what's really going on, because the information comes from the best sources on the subject, including, of course, directly from the Greek government itself, from the statistical department of the Greek government, which handles all the official numbers, basically of the Greek debt. I get that information firsthand from the actual lady that is. So, but really the Greek crisis, as I lay out in this book, Hellenic Crisis, has to do with basically the fact that not only Greece, but the whole world has been in a crisis for many, many, many years. I would say from the fall of the Byzantine Empire up until today. And I'll explain. Basically, the Byzantine Empire lasted for over 1,100 years. It basically Christianized the world, and not in a way where most Christians would think. In other words, saying that, for example, to a regular Protestant, he wouldn't understand, because he'd think that, that has to do with the Catholic Church. Most Protestants don't even understand what Greek Orthodoxy is, let alone the Byzantine Empire. And they would then group all this with Rome, which is evil, which is where the beast comes out of, and this and that. And, these people have their minds muddled, because that is true. But basically, the Byzantine Empire left its mark upon the world, and the world was sustained, and the world was basically developed and Christianized and enlightened too through the Hellenic culture because of the Byzantine Empire, and the forces that be were kept in check. Now, in 1453, basically, right around that time, it was actually 1450, basically the Ottoman Turks, along with the Venetian black nobility from Venice, came pounding on the doors of Constantinople because they tried to take over the empire. And the Greek Byzantines then, at that time, went to the west to seek basically help from their supposed Catholic brethren who, of course, with whom they had already been split for about 400 years. And they said, hey, you know what? We're both Christian, two sides of the same Christian empire, basically, because, the Byzantine Empire was the Christian empire in the east, and, of course, the Roman Empire, the Roman Christian Empire, was the empire in the west, basically. And so they asked the Catholics for help, the Catholic Church for help, basically to fight off the onslaught of the Ottomans. And, of course, the Catholics at that time told them, basically, if you want help from us, renounce Christian Orthodoxy and espouse complete Catholicism. So we basically pound sand, and we went on this issue on our own. So in 1453, eventually the Turks, they bust through the gates of the great city of Constantinople, and they took us over, and Greeks were enslaved for 400 years. But, however, I'd like to point out, though, most people, not only do they not understand, they don't know what the Byzantine Empire is, and that's why I talk about this in both of my books that I mentioned, but they don't even understand, those that do understand or have read about the Byzantine Empire, they don't even understand the causes of the fall of the Byzantine Empire. And the causes are not only because the Ottoman Turks, but because they had a huge major support from the black nobility of Venice. Now, who were these Venetians? They were nothing more than the powerful then Khazarian Jews, who basically were very powerful in banking and in trade. And they developed their own elite class, their own elite school on Aristotelian logic in Venice. They created counter-espionage. They're very powerful in world politics and very influential, and a lot of people feared them. They knew how to pit nations off against each other. And everything that you see today with the politics of America, of Great Britain, and other big major nations, all of that came from them. Henry Kissinger, who's played a major role in the destruction of Greece in the past 40 years, who's, of course, Jewish himself, he in his Harvard thesis wrote about how he has basically been influenced by the story of the Venetians, by Venetian politics, and how basically, he and the Rothschilds take their playbook for politics straight from the Venetians. So it was the Venetians who aided the Turks to collapse the Byzantine Empire, but there were also very powerful Jewish circles, Jewish communities inside and outside of the great city of Constantinople that were within the general Byzantine Empire who secretly gave aid to the Turks in order for them to destroy the Greeks. I'll give you one example. Top Greek scholars have written about how the reason why the gates were opened, the reason why the Turks were able to bust through the gates of Constantinople in 1453 is because there was a very prominent Jewish community that lived within the empire at that time that supposedly returned the Greeks, but they actually literally opened up the gates and the Turks to come in to invade the city. And, of course, once the city was invaded, the great city of Constantinople, from there there was a domino effect, and the rest of the Byzantine Empire collapsed with all its satellite states and basically all of that. Now, what happened after that was for 400 years we were enslaved, but it wasn't just really the Turks who did atrocities to us, but it was the very powerful Jewish communities there. For example, the first thing that the Turks allowed the Jews to do were to enslave thousands of young Greek children into the then world slave market, which was dominated by the Venetians. And this had all started back in the 1300s, whereupon some crazy, stupid deals were made between some Byzantine emperors at that time with some from Venice. And at this time, some Greek islands were basically sold off to Venice. And on those islands were enslaved Greek populations. And most people, don't know or haven't read about that. But this is a major historical fact. And at that point, the world slave trade was actually started by the Venetians. And after it gained success in the 1400s, they took it, guess where? Guess where else? To Africa. And it started from there with the black Africans. So, the Greeks have been dealing with attacks from these forces for many, many years. But in my book, Hellenic Crisis, I talk about how, when the Byzantine Empire fell, the Venetian black nobilitants, they basically began to become the new power, and they began to take over the legacy that the Byzantine Christians had left the world, began to secularize it. They took the elements, the good Christian elements of the founding beginning stages of the European Enlightenment, and they began to secularize them, and out of that came the first forms of basically Marxism, of communism. And it's a very long story, but the whole major issue...
According to Rabbi Weiss, some people call it communism. I call it Judaism for the masses.
Yes, that's right. And the problem with Greece today, as well as many other European nations, is that for all of this major history. And it's first of all, it's not even taught in the public schools. That's the problem. And it's a major cover-up. For example, in America, from the turn of the century, even up till today, the American government has clearly spoken about the threat of Jewish Bolshevism. I mean, the State Department for many years, from the 19-teens on to the 30s, did major reports on this issue. And this is a major issue, and there are good elements within the American government that are trying to expose this, because that's, where we're headed. I mean, but overall, in the case of America, we've already been screwed because we've allowed the United Nations to set up camp in New York, and that is the seat of world government, and the United Nations, through all these globalist groups, is influencing policy, the American government policy. It's influencing what our kids are taught in school, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's really, what the issue is. And Eustace Mullins, he writes about this in The World Order, his book, The World Order. And he basically says how when the Byzantine Empire fell, there fell also Western civilization into the hands of these powerful elite. Yeah, and what they did is
I've tried to tell people, John, I've tried to tell people, your Messiah, Jesus, your Christ, I had to warn you, beware the Jews who say they're Jews but are not, or of the synagogue of Satan. Why can't they understand that when you've got these Khazarians from dominating everything that we do here? I have really enslaved us again, and we're not aware of it. I've also told people that if you want to call yourself a Judeo-Christian, you might as well say, I'm a satanic Christian, thank you.
Yes, that's right. That's a whole major issue, which I heavily deal with in my first book I mentioned, Your Academic Guide to the Greek Language, Culture, and Civilization. And that book, I submitted it to a top publishing house of Fuller University here in Pasadena. Fuller is one of the biggest Christian universities in the world. It's huge. It's influential. So I basically submitted my script of this book that I mentioned earlier is meant to teach seminary students that it's not the Jews that are God's chosen people, it's the Greeks. The Greeks have this in order to enlighten the world. But when the Greeks turned away from this calling, they were then allowed to be overthrown by their enemies because we made a lot of mistakes in the Byzantine Empire. We also turned away from our calling. We also began to build a rapport with the Catholic Church in the latter stage of the Byzantine Empire, and many theologians, Greek and non-Greek, talk about how this is one of the reasons why God took his protection away from us and we basically fell to our enemies. And, basically I could say that same thing for America too. The reason why America is in this situation is because we've given in to our enemies. We didn't take care of them from the beginning when we should have. And if you look at the founding stages in this country, the Christians were very wide awake. The Christians did not believe in this myth where basically the Jews are God's chosen people. Let's let them run basically our whole society. Let's let them control education, banking, this, that, and everything else. No way. They were very awake. Your Sunday sermons were composed of a mixture of the gospel and, of course, the then threat of the Illuminati that was, of course, then, taking over America. But, America the great founding, the good founding fathers and the great patriots of this country, they did what they did up until the turn of the century, whereupon, of course, the Federal Reserve Bank was illegally installed in America. And then, of course, we know what the rest of the story is, basically from there. But Mullins clearly points out the fall of Western civilization happened with the Byzantine Empire. And so, basically, the Greeks were enslaved for 400 years. Then what happens, we arrive now to 1821 when the Greek Epanastasis occurs, meaning the revolution. And we are supposedly delivered from the Turks. And basically what happened really was this, and this is the whole story about Greece. Greece was never able to rebound and become a great nation again for the simple reason is that during that time, they resorted, unfortunately, some of their top leaders, not all of them, they resorted to Freemasonry in order to basically deliver themselves from the Ottoman Empire. And they were part of Freemasonic lodges, a lot of the Greek leaders in France and in England and these type of countries, and they sought help from them, and they thought, well, with liberty, brotherhood, and equality, basically we're going to be able to overthrow the Turks' yoke off of our neck. But the sad issue is that once they were delivered from the Turks, there were some moments in the then Greek government that took over the government in its founding stages of the new state of Greece, and one of them was a guy by the name of Ioannis Kapodistrias. He was from an elite Greek family, and he lived in Russia, and he had a lot of good rapport with the Orthodox, Russian czars at that time. So he came to Greece and he took over in the 1820s. And the first thing he did was outlaw in all of Greece Freemasonry. He made an edict and he said, from here on out, basically, this is outlawed because everyone in the world knows that we turned to Freemasonry to deliver ourselves from the Turks, and what a stupid mistake that was, because we basically allowed the enemy to come into our camp. A different type of enemy this time, separate, of course, from the Ottoman Turks. And what he did was he created that Bank of Greece, which is a bank wholly and solely devoted to building up the economy of Greece. It had nothing to do with the international money lenders. It was free and independent. Of course, the Rothschilds, they heard about that. They got kind of upset, to put it lightly, and they had the guy overthrown. And what they did was they chose a guy by the name of Otto from Bavaria, Germany, which also happened to be the seat of the Illuminati, and they bring him to Greece, and they installed him as king, as I believe it was 1831. And from there on out, these forces have been ruling Greece. Also in 1841, the Rothschilds created the National Bank of Greece. And in my book, Hellenic Crisis, I talk about how the whole crisis with Greece is just this. Basically, they went from one lord, one master, right when they were delivered from the Turks, immediately to another one, the international money lenders. And once they began to take loans to rebuild their nation, with the installation, of course, of the First National Bank of Greece in Greece, they are immediately under the threat of the international money lenders. For example, what do I mean? There were times when Greece couldn't pay their loans, England would send their ships to the Greek port of Piraeus, the famous port of Piraeus, which goes back to ancient times, and they would close off the ports and any export, any trading to be involved. They wouldn't allow the Greeks to do any trading, so they would hurt their economy that way. And there was a time too when the Greeks basically told the English to shove it, but the English basically sent their ships there to the port, and they threatened the Greeks with actual war. The international money lenders, though, they were the ones that had ordered this, because as we know, the Rothschilds at this time exerted heavy influence on the King of England, on the whole aristocracy at the time. As a matter of fact, they were the actual rulers of England. at that time, and they still are through the financial money system in cooperation with, of course, the Queen of England and other very powerful, very elite Jewish families from the Crown of England, as we all know. But Greece, they started taking loans.
We've got a dual citizenship. We've talked about this over the last week, and the fact that these attorneys, the Bar Association, they probably have their offices right across from the Rothschilds, and they're part of the corruption here in this country. What is happening? What's happening in Greece right now? We're getting we're getting fed clips. Greece is in all this problem, all these problems. I think that the international monetary money lenders, which have been around since Jesus' day, I think they are a little worried that Greece might follow the route of Iceland. What about that?
Well, Greece, the issue with Greece today is what I was talking about earlier, and that is they've been taking money from international monetary money lenders since the 1800s. And all the debts and all the financial problems they have today dates back to then. They've had debts, revolving debts, that date back, they still do, back then. These debts, of course, overall do not belong to the Greek people, just as this silly, what is it now, $17 trillion national debt of the United States of America does not belong to the American people. This is all used by which to enslave a nation. But with Greece, really what happened was this. They wanted to be part of the Eurozone. And if you want to take it even more deeper, they wanted to be part of the European Common Market, which of course became the European Union. And that's really what the problem is with Greece today. They're part of the European Union, in a nutshell. I wrote an article. I write for a top Greek newspaper in Greece, one of the biggest newspapers. It's called Eleftheri Ora, which means the free hour. It's circulated all over Greece, and it's also read on the media too. It's followed closely by the media. And I wrote an article called "The Big Euro IMF Scam." The Big Euro IMF Scam, and you can find that too on my blog, 300sploggers.com, 300sploggers.com. With that title, The Big Euro IMF Scam. And really, that's going to enlighten everyone about what's going on in Greece. And what I talked about in an article I just recently wrote for this big Greek newspaper is that basically Greece, when it decided to become part of the European Union and, of course, the Eurozone, that's really when all their problems started happening. And in 1999, the then Greek Prime Minister, Kostas Simitis, he basically had Goldman Sachs manipulate the financial books of the state of Greece so that Greece would look lend-worthy, so that Greece would look trustworthy for lending by, of course, so that Greece would look actually trustworthy so as to be allowed to enter into the Eurozone in order to adopt the euro. That's what the issue is. So Goldman Sachs, what they did was, in order to mask parts of Greek debts, they did this accounting trick, which involved currency swaps. They took basically some drachmas and they swapped them for like some Japanese yen and some dollars and things of that sort. And they made it look like Greece had more assets than it did. And in the same time, too, they all actually hid huge portions of Greek military spending. So Greece is then allowed by Brussels to get into the Eurozone. But actually, at that time, the statistical office in Brussels, Eurostat, was going through an internal crisis themselves, and they really didn't look into this issue about, Greece being aided by Goldman Sachs. And basically, Greece gets in. They immediately... it was a process. They get approval. In January 2002, they get the euro. So what happens? Immediately, inflation sets in. You go to the store, you buy a regular quart of milk. Usually it's let's say in terms of dollars, 50 cents. Now all of a sudden it's $2. So inflation sets in across the board. But it wasn't just that, though. What you had, too, were successive Greek governments who took major lending from the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, in order to buy major military expenditures, in order to pay for things in Greece, in order to pay for the Olympics, which occurred in 2004. And I just read the statistic how their budget for the Olympics was $6 billion. Well, they actually ended up spending $60 billion on basically designing the Olympics. And now, of course, all those infrastructures have rotted away. If you go see these amazing Olympic pools they've made, it's a disaster. I mean, they literally now look like ancient Greek ruins because no one has taken care of them in the past 10 plus years. So, you know, the Greek governments were taking a lot of lending. They're wasting this money. And basically, that was basically the issue. But leading up to now, though, to this present crisis, in 2009, though, Greece actually had dealt a lot with these debts and had somehow paid them off. And before they came under the control of the Troika from Europe, okay, which is the European Central Bank, the IMF, and the European Commission, their financial situation was pretty much sustainable and okay. And not only that, they actually had a surplus for that year, which was like 2 billion euros for 2009. But what happened was George Papandreou, the then prime minister, in late 2009, he, along with his cronies, with Goldman Sachs, with George Soros, they crafted this whole plan basically by which to put Greece under the control of the Troika and basically, in effect, enrich themselves. So George Papandreou goes to Strauss-Kahn of the IMF, and this is all mainstream news media reporting, and he basically, you know, tells them, we need funding to get out of the financial hole. So Strauss-Kahn looks at, we're talking about October 2009, Strauss-Kahn looks at all the numbers of Greece, and he's like, you guys don't need lending. You're actually okay. He goes, I don't recommend it. And he goes, you shouldn't be coming to me in private to talk about these things. This should be made a major issue with all the institutions of Europe. So George Papandreou basically, you know, he kept pressuring Strauss-Kahn. And what happened was Strauss-Kahn, before he wanted to agree to anything, he told George Papandreou twice in 2010, before, of course, Greece signed the first agreement with the Troika. He told George Papandreou, the first time I believe was March of 2010, hey, you know what? According to the treaty of the IMF, you know, Greece, they're allowed to reduce its debt by 50%, you know, and, you know, that'll make the Greek debt sustainable, and therefore the Greeks should be able to handle this crisis they're going through just fine. Wow, George Papandreou, he basically told him no. Can you imagine that? He told the guy who controls the IMF, no, we don't want to go that route because, you know, that's not where we're taking this issue. And Strauss-Kahn came to him again, even after Greece had signed the first agreement with the Troika. It was July of 2010. Strauss-Kahn came to him again in August and told him the same thing. Hey, we can reduce the Greek debt. George Papandreou, again, refused it, which makes, of course, everyone wonder, of course, you know, why. But in effect, in my research with all of what Greece has gone through the past 5 years and consulting the best journalists, of course, the Greek statistical office, it's called Elstat from Greece. The whole issue now, basically with this whole supposed $400 billion debt, which of course has basically forced the Greek people to undergo austerity measures, meaning cuts in salaries and pensions and all that stuff. This whole debt is a big fraud. And the way it's a big fraud, basically, is what led Greece into this, the way it became a fraud is what led Greece into the situation is today. For example, the lady that was one of the heads of the Greek office, her name is Zoe Yorgandas. Well, in late 2009, when George Papandreou was in the prime minister and who was crafting this whole scam, to screw the Greek people, she was approached by his administration and told specifically to blow up the Greek debt. In other words, to make it look a lot larger than what it actually was. And this entailed, of course, literally passing, old debts from the past onto the Greek books of that era, of that time, to make it seem like the Greek debt was out of control. And she was also told to fiddle with, of course, the deficit, which, according to statistical rules from Brussels, had to be around 6%, of the overall, national debt. To GDP. And basically, the deficit to GDP ratio is the biggest thing, of course, with Brussels. That's how they basically approve of a country entering into, of course, the Eurozone in order to adopt the euro. But basically, she was told to manipulate both of these figures, both the Greek debt and the Greek deficit. And this is what led Greece into the situation it is today, because due to those manipulations, that is what gave the pretext to put Greece under the control of the Troika, and then, of course, for the Greek people to undergo these very austere, cutback measures with salaries and pensions and public benefits and all that type of stuff. And the Greek people have suffered tremendously because of this, and it's a great fraud and a great evil perpetrated on the Greek people. George Soros, Hank Paulson, major Greek politicians are all involved in this scam. And basically, really what it has to do with this whole supposed Greek crisis has nothing to do with any crisis. There was no crisis because, like I said, Greece's financial situation was just fine. It had everything to do with the fact that the Greek people, as Eustace Mullen said, gave the greatest empire on the face of the world. The Greek people basically have given everything to the Western world. And the powers that be, the New World Order, the Rothschilds, the black nobility of today, as Henry Kissinger, of course, has in his own words, ascribes to. He is a Lombard politician type, and of course the Rothschilds are Lombard bankers. Of course, the Lombards were the bankers in Venice. These people today don't want Greece to become a powerful nation because once they realize that Greece will change the world. Now, Greece, of course, had two opportunities in the past 100 years. There was the Micronesian War between Greece and Turkey from 1919 to 1923, where the Greeks were taking back at that time old Byzantine lands. They had actually taken back at one point Constantinople in 1920. But the then Greek Prime Minister, Eleftherios Venizelos, he was a Rothschild agent, and he basically caused the defeat of the Greek forces, and the Greeks lost everything and came back to Greece defeated. There was another time where from 1967 to 1974, we had a Greek military junta in Greece. The reason why the military junta came in is because at that time, everyone in the Greek government, including, of course, the king of Greece at that time, Pavlos, they all understood there was a major threat of communism in Greece. And, of course, Greece had already undergone major problems with communism, and we even had a major civil war between the royalists and the communists that lasted from the 30s to, the 50s. And there was a lot of bloodshed that went on.
Let me stop you to fill in.
Yeah,
let me stop you to fill in a little blank spot. World War I, World War II, let's say World War II specifically, Hitler stood up against the Jews. Hitler stood up against the banking system and of course, Italy, Mussolini was with him. Where did Greece stand on that in that particular war?
Yeah, those are very critical. Those are very good questions. They were also very critical, which I'm actually dealing with the Greeks right now. Here's the issue with that, and that all ties in with what I'm saying, as a matter of fact, too. Hitler basically had a very he was motivated to deal with this scourge of basically world Judaism, let's say, in general. Basically, if he would have started a campaign, in my opinion, with my research, more of a greater campaign to alert basically forces in Europe of his plans, it would have been more successful if he got more nations on board. And he already did have a lot of nations on board, but he kind of spread himself too thin, and that's why Germany lost. But at that time, though, there's this whole myth that at that time Greece withstood Germany. Okay, for example, in October, late October, it's October, I believe, 31st, 1940, we have this day in Greece, this it's a national type of holiday called the No Day. In Greek, we say ohi, ohi. And supposedly at that time, the Italians came to the Greeks, to the then Greek Prime Minister, Metaxas, Ioannis Metaxas, because, Hitler is starting his campaign, and we need you to get on board with this, okay? So what happened was at this time, the then Greek Prime Minister, who, by the way, was an actual fellow student with Hitler in the school they studied in France. I'm talking again about the then Greek Prime Minister, Metaxas. And, of course, he knew Hitler very well. He told them, he goes, no, ohi in Greek. And so apparently this started the whole issue between Italy and Greece. So Italy comes in, invades Greece, and Greece routs them, okay? And then what happens is the Germans are like, oh, gosh, we got to come in and take care of the whole mess here. So the Third Reich comes into Greece and basically, crushes the Greek powers, immediately. And, of course, you had major scuffles all throughout Greece between Greek soldiers and German soldiers. In my father's Villerta, we're from ancient Sparta. Basically, we have monuments all over the place that talk about how, for every German that was killed by Greeks, the Germans killed 10 Greeks. Towards the end of the war, though, Ioannis Metaxas changed heart, and he realized, oh my God, Hitler is actually dealing with the scourge of world Jewry. And he wants to free the nations of this scourge. And this is what his whole goal is, okay? So, basically he starts sending Greek troops to the Third Reich, to German troops, from historical records that I've read, in order to fight off the Russian communists. Because at this time, here's the problem, here's the paradox. Greece, on the side of, the West, the Allies, basically, they're fighting in the beginning, the Germans, okay? But at the same time, they're undergoing, though, a civil war. So they're fighting two fronts right now. And the royalists in Greece, they were fighting basically not only, of course, the Germans, but they were also, because they had a lot of rapport with English troops who were helping them fight the Germans, but they were also fighting the communists. But here's the paradox, though. Greece overall at this time as a nation, not just the royalists, but also many communist elements, they're fighting the Germans. But the Greeks, though, that were royalists, basically who were fighting, the Germans and, of course, the communists, because there was a civil war, they realized the fact, though, that the reason why they had the threat of communism going on at the same time is because the Allies themselves allowed the communists to invade Greece. And that's the whole paradox. In other words, Greece is, fighting on the side of America and Great Britain and these type of nations. But in reality, it was America and Great Britain and other nations that were allowing the communists basically to invade Greece and other countries at this time while World War II is going on. And, Greeks are starting to realize that and, understand this great paradox. Like, oh my God, the very people that we were helping during World War II to fight the Germans are the very ones that released communism to our country and which has destroyed it. So this is a whole issue that I'm dealing with and slowly unraveling for the Greeks. Is they don't know a lot about these issues. There are some top Greek scholars that do. So basically, in a nutshell, here's the point.
Go ahead.
Hitler, okay, in a nutshell, Hitler, basically, he tried to get Greece on board, and he's like, okay, he tried to slap him around. You know, a lot of atrocities did happen in Greece on the side of the Germans, but the reason why it happened is because the Greeks did not understand what Hitler's goal was here. And unfortunately, these things did happen. There were atrocities. But if the Greeks would have understood, okay, things would have been a lot more different for Greece today. And of course, for the whole world, I believe that. If a lot of nations understood what Hitler's goal was, everything would have been a lot different. And, you know, we had major politicians. We had major celebrities helping Hitler. I mean, we had, of course, Henry Ford. So, you know, that's basically the whole issue in a nutshell with regards to that issue. Now, we have a party, by the way, real quick, called Golden Dawn. Have you heard of them, Clay?
Yes, I have.
Yeah, I support the party, and I'm editor for their website, for their official news website, for the English edition. I help them publish it, and I know a lot of the people that are involved. Some of them know them very well. So basically, their whole goal right now is to get Greeks to understand what I just talked about, between basically the Nazis' relations with the Greeks and all that type of stuff. And a lot of the Greeks, they don't understand. And they have this whole issue going on in Greece, how we need war reparations from the Germans and this and that, blah, 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 and everything else. Okay, that's fine. So let's say they owe us. But see, today the problem is not the German people with the Greeks, and like it was back then. It wasn't, you know. Well, let's talk about today, because back then it was different with Hitler. But today the problem with Germany is not the German people. It's the very powerful Jewish banking circles that control Merkel that are screwing Greece. They are the problem for Greece, not the German people. So,
well, let me ask you, there's a couple of questions. There's one that's been in the back of my mind. And I've told people, you know, going over these stories every day, that it might be possible that after being under communism for 100 years, the Russian people under Putin have said, whoa, wait a minute, we can take this back. And one writer that I saw some of his work said that, and that may have been Edgar Casey, said that Russia was the hope of the world. And it's occurred to me that we might be in a position, the whole Cold War, in my opinion, was a farce, was a false flag. Be afraid, be very, very afraid. The Russians are coming, the Russians are coming. Hollywood gave us that. Now, when I see Putin on some news clips, it seems to me he is favoring the Greek Orthodox Church. And is it possible that Putin is not a communist at all, but is a religious leader that is standing up against the oligarchs and backing church? What are the chances?
Well, that's a huge issue in Greece. That's an issue that I've been dealing with a lot too, writing articles about it. Putin, of course, is a former KGB agent.
Yes.
Putin just, it was April of this year or May, I believe. I think it was May. It was May. He just had this big commemoration take place in Russia, where the Russians basically commemorated how the Stalin regime resisted the Nazis. So here you have, in May of this year, hundreds of world leaders attending this conference, including, of course, our present Greek government. They sent delegates there too, to commemorate how the communist Russians basically dealt with Hitler. And you see, Clay, on TV, Russian soldiers of today carrying that ugly, we use a lot of characterizations for this flag, that ugly red flag with the hammer and the sickle. And here I am saying to myself, is there wrong with this picture? Gee, I thought this was now the great Christian Orthodox Russia of Putin, which has nothing to do with communists, because we all know that what the communists, of course, the Jewish Bolshevik communists did to Russia for 70 years. Okay, now if Putin is basically a great defender of Orthodox Russia, which is, of course, the enemy of the Jewish Bolsheviks, and the Jewish Bolsheviks, of course, in their own plans stated how they needed to eliminate the Tsar, his regime, of course, Orthodox Christianity. If that's the case with Putin, why in the heck are they having this national celebration, okay, of how the communists fought off the Nazis? Is there something wrong with this picture? You see the Russian soldiers carrying the red flag with the hammer and the sickle. And could it just be basically a national holiday that they were commemorating because, it had to do with a historical event and this and that and blah, blah, blah? Because, Putin in the past has clearly stated how, the Bolshevik regime was composed primarily of Jews that did these atrocities. Okay, Putin has said that in the past. But here's the issue, though, with the Putin of today. And I would say, more importantly, the Putin of the past several years. And there's a reason why I say that. In the past several years, at least, we've seen Putin take trips to Israel. Of course, the Jews are the ones who were the founders of communism. The first, of course, communes were the kibbutz in Israel at the turn of the century. We've seen him go there, wear the Jewish yarmulke, to go to the Wailing Wall, to do all this type of stuff. The Jews even named the street after him in Israel, okay? He has rapport with Henry Kissinger, with Benjamin Netanyahu, with all these criminal types. And basically, he allows major rabbis, Chabad Lubavitch, to influence his government. His government is full of them, okay? Could it be that Putin is just playing their game? This is what I think. And, because he understands how powerful the Jews are, and he can't take them all on at once. Could it be he's just playing their game? Well, besides all that, what people can do is basically look at the facts for themselves. Now, we do know that Putin, of course, is a Freemason. Okay, and there's pictures of him with George Bush and all these leaders from China and these other countries wearing these Freemasonic garbs and meeting with each other basically in major summit meetings. And they're all in Freemasonic, attire. But could it be, though, that Putin is just playing this game because he's really this great patriot leader? In my opinion, unfortunately, no. And the reason why I say that is because it was Eustace Mullins who said every world leader is an actor, a little actor, on this world drama that is being unfolded before our very eyes on behalf of the New World Order. But that being said, 2 months ago, Putin's former wife came out into the news, and she gave an interview to one of the biggest German newspapers, The Bild. Of course, a lot of people in America haven't heard about it. The reason being hushed up by Western media. She comes out and she basically says to the German Bild, and I have this recorded with Greek video media clips, the Putin, she says, that you see in government is not him, she says. It's his double. Putin has been dead for several years. The reason being is because the real Putin, she says, was assassinated because he basically took on the powers that be. So they had to eventually get rid of him. And she says, I remember the night when they sent his double in, and he told me straight, if you or the kids say anything, you're dead. She said this to a top German newspaper. They ran with the story. This was all over European news.